When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 146. I'm your host, Chris Webster, with my co-host, Paul Zimmerman. Today we discuss big data in archaeology again, but we start with Paul's volunteering at a local museum and really use that as a discussion to talk about the future of some archaeological publishing as a result of COVID in 2020. Let's get to it. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. Welcome, Paul. How's it going, man?
It's okay at the moment. You and I were just having a nice chit chat about this and that and everything else.
Yeah.
But we are recording currently on Tuesday, the 19th of January. And this is the first day back to school with significant numbers of students and teachers present in the school. And this morning was unbelievably hectic. And so I'm sure this conversation with you and me, Chris, is going to go way off the rails today because I'm 2 beers in and I've already cracked a bottle of wine.
Nice.
But I'm decompressing a bit from, the hectic nature of this morning, and things are, nothing bad happened. It was just, we can't get the neat bar to work. We can't get this to work. I'm not on the network. What's going on? What happened to my account? Just all that stuff piling up at a faster rate than we could deal with it.
Yeah.
But we got through it by noon. And then after that, I just had to deal with a bunch of other crud that came down my way. You see, I said crud instead of other words. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm not doing too bad. Yeah, I think, I don't know where I was last time we spoke. If I think about the time frame, I think I was still in Charlotte, North Carolina, but now we're in Florida, Port Orange, Florida, technically out near Daytona Beach, which is a little easier to orient off of. Daytona Beach is like a 5-minute drive from us.
Okay.
So it's interesting down here because there's no pandemic in Florida. I don't know if anybody knew that, but I'm not sure if it was ever here. So
Floridians are immune to that, I think.
Oh my God. Yeah. Well, it must be the sun, right? Because the sun kills it, according to our best scientist, which is Donald Trump. So
he's pretty good. He's the best.
He's huge.
Huge.
So huge. Yeah. So you had a first day today back to school. We also have a last day in this country today, which we'll see what the country looks like tomorrow after 100 criminals are released from prison tonight, according to all the news reports. So,
don't even get me started on all the Blackwater stuff. That was just boiling.
I know. So, hey, let's talk about some better things, because I can't remember if we mentioned this on the show, but you and I have definitely talked about it, pre and post and stuff like that. But you started volunteering at a museum up in near where you live. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Right. Okay. So the museum, I mentioned this a couple episodes ago when we were talking about gifts, tech gifts for archaeologists. I said, one thing that you might want to do, which is a nice gift, is give somebody a membership to a local archaeological association or a small museum or something. And then I took that to heart and applied it to myself and got membership at the Institute for American Indian Studies, which is in Washington, Connecticut. And that's a very short distance from where I live in Brewster, New York, as the crow flies, but there's a big lake between us. And it takes me about 45 minutes to drive out there. Anyway, that's not important. The important thing is that I found out about this because I was cleaning up my meetup notifications to get rid of things that I was definitely not going to be participating in during a global pandemic, namely pick up soccer games in New York City. And seeing if there's something closer to me that interested me: hiking, nature, history, archaeology. And I found out that this place actually has an archaeology club that runs a little excavation at, I think it's an archaic Indian site right next door to the museum.
Okay.
And so I saw that and I was like, oh, cool. So I contacted the people at the museum and said, could I volunteer? And yes, I have. And so under the watchful eye, I guess, of Paul Wegner, who is the assistant director of the museum. I hope I've got that right. I'm sorry, Paul, if I got your title wrong with that. I've been helping out in their collections. I've been helping with a little bit of cleanup and cataloging and putting away in their storage facilities some of the materials. They had a huge donation of contemporary Native American art pieces that was donated to them by somebody who passed away recently. Wow. And that's taken up the entirety of their workroom. So they need to clear that out so they can actually process some other things. And so I've been doing that. It's been enjoyable. I've been going there on the weekends for the last few weekends, and I will continue doing so in the future. You asked me this because you had something in mind. What was that?
Well, you mentioned that they do a field school, which is interesting on a couple levels for me because I didn't really know that any museums, or especially small like local museums, even did field schools. My question is, well, and you mentioned too that they obviously didn't do their field school last summer because nobody did because COVID, and we just couldn't get together like that. But my question that I'll ask related to that, I'll ask this one first. What do they do with the field school data? Do they publish this? Is this something that they just keep with the museum? Or you do even know that yet? Like, have you even gotten that far with asking them that?
I don't know that fully yet, but first off, it's not a field school. It's a club, an archaeology club, but it's supervised by actual archaeologists. So Paul himself is an RPA, and the person that I contacted initially is also an archaeologist and a professor at, I think, Western Connecticut University. I'd have to double check. But then when I was there, there's another, not volunteer, but somebody who's working on some of their older collections, things that were donated to the museum. Her name is Stephanie. She's a contractor, a CRM archaeologist based out of Stores. And she took a lot of time to show me a bunch of lithics because she's working on an idea about where archaic and Paleo-Indian sites are in northwestern Connecticut. And I'm just beginning to get my brain around the terminology and the periodization and the typologies and such. So if I misspeak about any of this, it's because I'm an idiot and I don't know this stuff yet, but I'm trying to learn. It's so much fun trying to learn. Anyhow, so the materials that they get from the excavation go into the museum and they get cataloged, and some of them get displayed in the museum. They get properly processed by actual archaeologists, and then they have a very good storage facility in the museum. They have to reorganize that storage facility because they also work with modern contemporary artists and anthropological materials in conjunction with various tribal organizations and with natives in positions of authority that can actually, mediate this. It's not just one of these, white guys going and collecting stuff kind of organizations. They actually are very conscientious and very much engaged with a number of different communities. But the archaeological materials are then going into the museum and going to, getting cataloged properly, getting photographed and all the rest, and conserved and filed away. But they're a tiny little museum. And so they can use extra help. And so it's been fun for me because, like I said, again, a few episodes before, I'm going to be getting myself out of ed tech this next year and hopefully into CRM archaeology and doing that for a living.
Nice.
And this is a toehold for me to actually learn about the materials, learn about my local area, which I've never known anything about archaeologically, and learn what the materials look like, know what the lithics look like, know what the terminology is for the periodization, all down the line. And everybody's been extremely accommodating, and it's been fun. I mean, it's really a lot of fun for me to actually work with. And so far, I've only been working with these donated art objects from contemporary artists. Sure. But the kind of standards that you apply are very similar, right? In terms of measuring, documenting, cataloging, conserving. Not that these art objects need conservation, but they certainly need to be wrapped up carefully and packed properly to be put in storage so they don't break. So this all resonates with me, and it's all been a hell of a lot of fun. And that's what I've been occupying myself with.
Nice. Well, the thing that made me think about it, especially just when you said, anytime I think non-CRM archaeology dig, I think field school. So that's why I said field school. But even so, they're still digging, they're still excavating. Because I was actually wondering, my wife, Rachel's an archaeologist as well. We recorded an episode of the Archaeology Show where we discussed some news articles that are in the news lately or have been in the last couple of months. So we just wanted to bring those up and talk about them. And something that I can't even remember if we talked about on the air, but maybe we're talking about just pre or post, was the journal cycle, like the journal article cycle, how that's going to be affected by no field schools happening in 2020 pretty much around the planet. And there may be some field schools happening now, like Southern Hemisphere field schools that are experiencing their summer at this point in places that, maybe have dealt with the pandemic a little better. I don't know. But chances are we're going to be hit pretty hard by that, because a lot of academic papers are written by people doing field schools and people analyzing those data sets at the end of the summer and then analyzing them over the winter and fall, and then, starting to publish that stuff in the spring and summer coming up. Now, it might just be that they have a chance to get caught up because I would imagine a lot of that is very far behind, and maybe they've got the chance to write those papers that they haven't had a chance to write that just go a little bit more in depth with some of these topics and really explore those further. I hope that's really the case. And we have plenty of papers, I have no doubt, coming up in the next couple of years, but I think we're going to feel the effects and just see a different kind of majority paper probably in the 2022 cycle, to be honest, maybe not even 2021, because the cycle for doing Journey's journal articles is usually pretty long. But I imagine 2022, 2023 is going to be different and deeply affected by 2020.
No, I agree with you. And I actually have an idea about that, because I know that while Peru, for example, was having a lot of military and paramilitary troubles, a lot of archaeologists who worked there started publishing old data, things that they excavated, 5-10 years ago that they never got around to publishing. But now, because they couldn't do any field work, they had no other choice but to publish. Certainly, me as a Near Eastern archaeologist, this is something I've seen between Iraq, where I initially wanted to work, Yemen, where I subsequently wanted to work. I've been chasing around places that have fallen into strife in a way that absolutely precludes doing any kind of field work. And though that's a shame in human terms, I think that in scientific terms for the field of archaeology, it's actually beneficial to have these kind of interstices where you can't do the field work, which is your default position as most archaeologists. And you have to then go back to what you did 2, 3, 4 years ago, analyze it, process it, write it up, publish it. Even though it's an absolute horrific shame what the world has gone through and what our country has gone through over 2020, and I'm sure it'll be well into 2021. For our field as archaeologists, it might actually give a lot of elbow room to do new stuff with previously collected data. And I think that is actually, perversely, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think so too. And the sheer amount of data that we collect on some of these sites just makes it so that it's really, really difficult to process this information in a timely manner, right? I mean, we've got tools and stuff that are coming around about that, but it's just really, really difficult to handle all this stuff. So I think possibly along those lines, we're going to enter into our discussion about big data in relation to an Ars Technica article that we're linking in the show notes that I mentioned in the introduction, and we'll do that on the other side of this break. Back in a second. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code Archaeotech. That's ARCHAEOTECH. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode. All right, welcome back to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 146. And as I alluded to in the last segment, we're going to talk about big data, the primary topic of today's episode. And actually, I originally found this article because I've got an archaeology subject, I guess, saved as something I follow on my Apple News feed. And I check it probably daily and save different articles and things like that I want to read or talk about or something. Yep. And it's interesting the different news outlets that come up with some of this, because Ars Technica is not one I would have necessarily thought about coming out with an archaeology article. Then I saw who the author was, and it's Jennifer, and I'm pretty sure you pronounce it Ouellette, because I've seen her before on other things. She is part of a power couple, if she's still with him. I can't remember the guy's name that she's married to, but he's like a well-published physicist or astrophysicist or something like that. God, I can't remember what the guy's name is, but her and him together, like I think she's in biology, like her background, or like genetics or something really highly technical, but both of them are incredibly smart, well-published people. But she also does writing for different journal outlets and things like that. And one of these is Ars Technica. So
yeah, I think Ars Technica and Forbes, ironically, because Forbes used to publish garbage, they right now are the two go-to mainstream venues for good discussions of archaeology, in my opinion.
Yeah, they're publishing some great stuff. And I do have some, I guess, things that I didn't find too flattering that I wanted to say about the first part of the article, but I think that's more our fault than her fault. Mm-hmm. So I'll talk about that in a second here. But the article is called "Archaeology is Going to Digital to Harness the Power of Big Data." And then it says, basically as a subtitle here, combining traditional pick and trowel fieldwork with a sweeping bird's eye view. Ars Technica published this on January 2nd, 2021. So this is basically in response to the Journal of Field Archaeology special edition on big data that was published before that. And we'll link to that in the show notes so you can see more details about it. It's open access, which from a journal coming from Taylor and Francis is surprising and welcomed, I guess, because ordinarily, we don't get access to these articles unless you know somebody and they can send you a PDF. But so this is completely open access. So we'll definitely send it over. And it actually says it's the February special edition, which of course is already released because of the weird naming of journal articles, months and things like that. So
right. And it's based off of a special session at the 2019 SAA meeting. So maybe that's why it's open access. I'm not quite sure why, but I haven't read most of the articles in here, but holy cow, this looks like an absolute goldmine of really cool new ideas. So definitely click that link, go download some of these PDFs and read them and, elucidate yourselves.
Yeah. And I was at the 2019 SAAs. I'm trying to remember where the heck they were.
I was going to ask.
Because I've been to pretty much all of them for the last 6 or 7 years. And I know it was I'm trying to remember where the heck it was. Since we skipped a cycle, now I've totally lost it in my brain since we didn't go to Austin in 2020. I think that's where 2020 was supposed to be. Yeah, anyway. Yeah, right. So wherever that was, when Paul tells us soon, there's a good chance I was in this session because this is the kind of thing I would have gone to. Yeah, I mean, I want to just make some points about this article, which again is not the author's fault. It's not Jennifer Ouellette's fault. It's really our fault for not representing them. By our, I mean archaeologists' fault for not really, getting our heads in the game with this whole thing, right? But she makes it sound like this is happening right now. Of course, Paul and I have been talking to people doing big data stuff for years now, right? Several years. And the people that we've talked to have focused their entire careers around these kinds of things. I mean, you look at Eric Kanza and Sarah Kanza, who run Open Context and that whole thing with that. And that's kind of a side part of the DINA project, the Digital Index of North American Archaeology, I think is what it is. Anyway, big data has been a concept that archaeologists have been talking about for a really, really, really long time. It's just for some reason now we're getting the tools, and we're getting the tools I think are becoming more affordable and more accessible to more and more archaeologists. And that's a good thing, right? Obviously, that's a good thing because we've always had big data. We just haven't had the tools to handle the big data we've been recording. I mean, you look at some of these excavations. I mean, let's even go back to like Egypt, right? King Tut's tomb or something like that. The mountain of data they recorded in the 1920s when that tomb was discovered was phenomenal, and was all done on paper notebooks.
Right.
And so that's never changed. We've always had a wealth of information, and we've just, through our tools, increased the amount of stuff that we've been recording. And now we have some more tools to actually analyze those big data sets, which I think is really the thing you need to talk about here is not collecting and storing big data. It's analyzing big data and coming up with patterns that we didn't see before.
Well, it's interesting that you're talking about big data, and we've discussed this on the podcast before, what actually constitutes big data. They kind of hint at in this article, in Houlette's article, what big data means for the context of this discussion. But I like that you talk about Egypt and King Tut's tomb, because that's when I teach archaeology. I talk about stuff that happens in the 19th century in Iraq and Syria, but when it really takes off as archaeology, not just treasure hunting or antiquarianism, is in the range around 1920 to 1930, which encompasses King Tut's tomb. It also encompasses the Royal Cemetery of Ur, which is my specialty for my MA paper. And now, wow, I'm feeling really good. I feel like I'm doing some big data stuff, because way back in 98, when I did my MA, I looked at measurements and elevations of different layers of the soil in the Royal Cemetery in order to try to reconstruct, because some of the measurements from the excavation were done from a benchmark, and some of them were done up or down from the layer of the soil at that particular point, because the soil has different colors and as it slopes downhill. And so I tried to do that to understand the architecture. Anyhow, so that was not big data, but it's the beginnings at that point of the collection of data at a scale that 100 years on, we can talk about as quote unquote big data, or at least analyze with the tools of big data. And I think that's that analyze with the tools of big data that this article is specifically about. And I do also want to call out very quickly here that they talked to two archaeologists in the article, Stephen Wernke, and I'm sorry that I've mispronounced your name one way or the other, and Parker van Valkenburg. And Parker has been on this podcast twice now. He was on episode 95, where he was not talking about big data per se. He was talking about data collection, but also episode 133 last year, I believe that would be, where he in fact was talking about big data. And a lot of the stuff that gets talked about in this article, he also talked about on this podcast. So it resonated with me. It reminded me of things that he said, and it was kind of exciting to see it down in this, even though APN, we try to be as big as possible. We're not a Condé Nast backed publication medium like ours is. So it was nice to see it on the big stage per se.
I wish we could get our arse over to some money like Condé Nast, but it's not going to work, right? All right, maybe. So Paul mentioned he looked it up while we were talking there in the chat. It was the Albuquerque SAS. That was 2019. I do remember that one because I drove to that one weirdly because I was doing a project over in Southern California, Arizona area, and it was easier just to drive there because I was already down there. So yeah, now I remember that one. So, one other thing I'll mention here that the article she mentions right at the beginning is, I'm just going to read this sentence. Archaeology is finally catching up with the so-called, quote, digital humanities, unquote, as evidenced by a February special edition of the Journal of Field Archaeology devoted entirely to discussing the myriad ways in which large-scale data sets and associated analytics, which I think is the key phrase there, are transforming the field. I think that's really been the big thing missing, because there is a lot of bias in archaeology, and really, I don't even mean like bias towards, small things that you might think of when you think of bias. I mean bias just because we have our own cultural perspective as people who live in the 20th century, right? We have our own cultural perspective growing up and how we did things. And it's hard to look at something that's thousands of years old in a culture far, far divorced from yours. Even if we're looking at something, say, on our last archaeology show, we talked about Pompeii. One of the articles we mentioned was this one that went around all over the place. Everybody reported on it, but it was that like food stand that they fully excavated and almost reconstructed.
Right,
in Pompeii, yeah. But it turns out there's like 80 of them there, right? This is just the first one that's been fully excavated and looks nice and they can finally talk about it. Turns out they were all over Rome. Of course there would be, right? That's one of the things that where our cultural bias would be like, yeah, okay, sure, that makes sense because this was a big city. People got to eat. People got to make money. Those two things intersect and hashtag food trucks. So
yeah, I'm glad that you said food trucks because that's exactly what I was thinking about these. I mean, not just food trucks, but bodegas, depending where you are in the country, right? Fast food joints, whatever else. It transforms where you are across the United States, but it's the same sort of thing.
Yeah, anywhere you have an intersection of a whole bunch of people that are from different areas and they are doing certain things that is their livelihood as far as what their careers are. And you have a large enough society that not everybody has to cook and grow food and do all those things for themselves. Mm-hmm. They actually have money where they can buy that stuff. Anytime you have that, the market is going to create food for those people. And it's going to create that, like that invisible hand, right? It's going to create that thing that's going to say, okay, we'll supply you food if you're going to supply us money. And that's how that's going to happen. And I think that's probably been around for as long as we've had people in those situations. It's just a natural thing. So that's a good assumption we can use our cultural bias for. We can say, yeah, that was probably used for this because why wouldn't it be, right?
Right.
If I'm walking around a city, I'm going to want to eat something and I don't have a garden in my back pocket. So I can't just do that. Now, you look at 2,000 years ago in North America, and there are some parallels. There are some things that you would say, yes, I would assume in these areas that these things did exist. Now, I have no firsthand knowledge of it, but in places like Cahokia, some of the bigger, like southwestern cities, for lack of a better word, because they really were cities, like Chaco Canyon, at Pueblo Bonito, places like that, different places, obviously down in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and, around those areas where you have these big cities, I would just make the natural assumption that yes, there were probably similar things there. Maybe there wasn't like a food stand or something like that, but people were probably selling things that you could eat while standing on the street, unless there was some, cultural or religious prohibition against that, right? Like something that said, oh, I can't touch something made by another human, but I just can't see that being the case. I would make that assumption.
Or, my mother-in-law talks about how she was raised in Eastern Europe in the first half of the 20th century. You shouldn't be eating on the street because other people might not have, the same access to food, and therefore you're kind of rubbing it in their noses. So there are plenty of different kinds, like cultural reasons why you wouldn't necessarily do that. It might be uncouth in that example to be eating in front of other people unless, you were a laborer and had no other choice.
Right.
There are a lot of different ways to look at it. And that's actually, I think, one of the advantages of when we look at archaeology and anthropology with a very broadly open mind is that there are different ways that you can interpret an almost identical situation. Right? Sure. And understand that it might have different impulses, different kind of cultural baggage behind it for why something is done or not done. But as archaeologists, we often don't have access to that because it's from societies that are long gone. We can't go and interview somebody and ask them why they do this or why they don't do that. So this is just a call, a general call to keep an open mind about the different ways that you can approach the same situation, come to the same conclusion for entirely different reasons.
Right. So I started out this discussion by really talking about what big data can do for us. And I think we've illustrated really well, in my mind, what the analysis of these big data sets can actually do for us. And let's bring that up in segment 3 on the other side of this break. Back in a second. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
welcome back to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 146. Today, Chris and I are having kind of a, off the top of our heads discussion about big data and this and that. And back to this Ars Technica article, I want to bring out a couple things that just struck me as resonant with what we've discussed on this podcast in the past, particularly with Dr. Van Valkenburg. The first one was that Stephen Wernke, and again, Wernke, I apologize, mea culpa, that I mispronounced your name one way or the other. But anyhow, he says that he wants to complement, and that's the word that was pulled from the article, traditional fieldwork, which is what we as archaeologists tend to value most highly, with digital tools. And I think that is absolutely 100% spot on with what we, Chris, you and I like doing, right? We both are field archaeologists at our core, and we both like tech, and we both think that the tech can totally enhance what the field archaeology does. And field archaeology, in terms of methods and methodologies, hasn't changed much in a good 100 years, with the exception of what's been layered upon it with different technological approaches, with different ways of we can analyze, reinterpret our data, right? So you had digital tools, which is the last 30 or so years, of 40 years maybe, have just expanded that, exponentially. But then the other one I want to highlight here was Parker Van Valkenburg, who has been on our podcast a couple of times. And this resonates with what he was talking about in episode 133. So the quote is, "So it's natural that big data analytics are first being applied to data sets that weren't specifically collected for archaeological analysis in the first place, like satellite data." And that, I thought, was just really got to the nub of what we as archaeologists do. And Chris, you and I as tech-heavy archaeologists do, is that there's very little archaeological analysis, archaeological theory, archaeological anything that comes from archaeology per se. We tend to be these like sponges that soak up things from anthropology and sociology and chemistry and physics and whatnot, and figure out ways to use it. And so when I read that, I just immediately thought of, okay, so I'm going to put on my professorial hat here and talk about Klaus Levi-Strauss, right? So archaeology in the US is anthropology, first and foremost. And it's one of the four fields anthropology disciplines. And as a anthropology undergrad, a long, long time ago, I read an English translation of Klaus Levi-Strauss's The Primitive Mind. And Klaus Levi-Strauss, this French anthropologist and sociologist and philosopher who devised this notion of structuralism, about how to analyze societies and how they structure themselves. I did not like that book one bit. I did not like the writing style one bit. But one thing that really stuck out to me, the only thing that really stuck out to me that I've never been able to shake in the 30 or so years since I read that book, was that he talks about bricolage and bricoleuse, which is this ability to take pieces of this and that and the other and create something new. And he's talking about it from the art world, but then passing it back into the anthropological world.
Right.
And I think why it's stuck with me is because that's what archaeologists have always done. We've always been bricoleurs. That is, we take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and we mash them together to make something new in this really cool way. And so I can't get away from the notion of Levi-Strauss's bricolage and what Parker Van Valkenburg is talking about here with taking these different kinds of technologies. And he specifically mentions satellite data, but there's certainly other ones. There's certainly other ones that he uses, and he discussed them again on this very podcast, about how we take these pieces and we put them together, and we mash them together and see what fits and what doesn't fit and what makes kind of a cohesive whole that can stand up on its own. And this is exciting to me because I think that that's where big data, quote unquote, big data, has been working its way into archaeology. It's not that we can use big data as big data, but we look at the tools of big data, the things that the people that analyze, Google searches for example, we'll use.
Yeah.
And we take the pieces of those that we can, graft onto this funky bicycle we're building and use them. And so that was exciting, because this is the first time I think I've ever seen in a major media piece anybody approach that kind of ad hoc, experimental sort of archaeology. And I think that, again, this is something that you and I, and probably every other person that does archaeotech, quote unquote, and a good number of our listeners do, is that they take different pieces of things that excite them and interest them, and they try to figure out how they'll fit together to make a new understanding, a new analysis of their world. So that's what really got my juices flowing when I was reading this article. Was I saw that and I was like, oh, I know that. I feel that in my bones.
Yeah. Yeah. That's all very well said and pulled out of that article, because what was really striking me about it too, because I responded as well to some of those comments that Parker was making about, taking some of those other data sets that weren't originally collected for archaeology, like satellite data, like you said, or even we have large LiDAR data sets now that were, very clearly not collected for archaeology, but could be used in that way now. And, a lot of this big data analytics, which is what we're talking about here, is finding these either intersecting patterns where we have different data sets, one that maybe was collected for archaeology and one that was not, and finding out where they can come together in ways that we just can't see because there's too much data, or taking either one of those big data sets and applying different rules to them and applying different filters to them and saying, well, what can we get out of it based on this? And that's what I was leading to with that whole second segment, talking about what archaeology has done in the past and your biases and things like that. These big data analytics can help remove our biases and show us those patterns that would otherwise be invisible. And we might say, well, that pattern doesn't make any sense. Well, that doesn't mean it's not real. It's still a pattern, and patterns don't happen naturally. They happen naturally in the context of that humans are natural. You know what I mean? So humans have natural behaviors and tendencies that any psychologist will tell you, hey, we're all basically the same. It's textbook. like if this happens and this happens, you're going to be this kind of person. And I hate to say it, but that almost always rings true, right? You always have your outliers, but if a certain set of circumstances takes place, like in your childhood, your upbringing, there is a statistical probability that you're going to have some of these attributes when you grow up to be a human, if nothing else changes, right? Yeah. And that's because we're humans. We fall into these patterns and we fall into these things, but it's difficult for us to see outside of that and for us to see these things that would be these patterns coming out of these big data analytics. And then you take those different data sets and you mash them together, like you said, Paul, and you come up with completely different theories about things that we thought we understood because we couldn't see that big. It's just not possible.
I'm going to be a little bit of a pedant here and say that there are patterns that happen naturally. You think of like the stratification of glacial varves, right?
Sure.
That's a pattern.
Yeah. Tree
rings, that's a pattern. There are lots of patterns that happen naturally, but we as educated, as intelligent, as observant human beings, whether we're archaeologists or any other kind of researcher whatsoever, to try to differentiate those patterns that happen naturally and those patterns that happen because of human behavior. And so I'm just going to, back to the first thing you brought this in on. As I was leaving the museum the other day, a woman came in with her two daughters, and one of the daughters, probably about fifth grade, had 4 different things that she'd collected out on hikes in the Northeast. She's like, I think these are points.
Wow.
And I looked at them, and one of them was a beautiful piece of slate that was almost certainly not manipulated by people. It was rounded from weathering and whatnot, but it was this long, thin, pointed object, right? Mm-hmm. Another one was a piece of quartz, really thick and chunky, but it looked to me like it had retouching around the edges. Another one was this kind of triangular tanged, looked like a partial point. Also fairly heavily weathered, but I couldn't quite tell. And another one, she's like, I think this might be like some kind of cutting implement or whatnot. And I couldn't tell whatnot. It definitely was triangular in cross section, was about 3 inches long, and may have had a cutting edge.
Sure.
And so even though I don't know New England lithics, I had this great little teaching moment with this child to be able to say, okay, so this one here doesn't look like human made because I don't see anything about it that says humans. This one here, even though it's kind of ugly, it's a stone that's very hard to make thin, right? To make beautiful points, but it looks almost certainly to have been retouched on the edge, which I'm willing to bet. Give me 90, 95% that this is human made. The other one, because of the shape, even though the weathering, I was like, you know what? I think this looks just like some stuff that we've got over there in the cabinet.
Right.
Just inside. And then the last one is like, I have no idea. But it shows that identification of patterns that are human versus those patterns that are non-human, I think is really important. So that's me just being pedantic here. But that's where the big data stuff actually, I think, really can apply itself to, because nobody that's doing this is an idiot. Everybody that's doing this really wants to find out what are meaningful patterns and what are random or non-human or basically like harmonic patterns, right? So you pluck a string and it has a harmonic vibration. That's a pattern. It doesn't mean that people designed that. So that ability to think through those things, I think, is really interesting. And actually, that brings me kind of roundabout and maybe a little forced, but to one of the other quotes I had from Parker. He said, archaeology is great at the small things, right? It's looking at small stories. Like, how did this post hole get made? How did this pit, this trash pit get made? And at what time period, right? And that's something we've all grappled with. Does it relate to the surrounding architecture? Does it predate it? Is it something intrusive from later? Why is this sherd up in this level? Was it deposited at that level, or was it moved there by a rodent sometime, decades, centuries, millennia later? So those small stories, he says, archaeology is great at, the field archaeology. Again, back to what Stephen had to say. But the big data is really useful, he said, for building these kind of generalizing models, these covering models and such, which I was thinking about, 50 to 100 years ago, those big models of how people interacted and how societies evolved and everything were not made with all that much data. Archaeologists often, sociologists often, thinking through, doing word problems, but they didn't have the data to back it up necessarily. They had a few bits of data that they could use to try to piece together something huge like Oriental despotism and riverine cultures and whatnot. And now we actually have the tools, if we're willing to look there, to try to assess these things. And so that's what, again, back to this article and back to what Parker was talking about in episode 133, looking at the Inca road network and trying to figure out how that worked in conjunction with the Spanish conquest of South America, and seeing patterns, meaningful human-generated patterns for why that would be a case, which I think is really cool. And, this is way beyond my pay grade. This is way beyond my mental capacity, but I'm at least, I think, maybe smart enough to understand that there's some there.
Well, and when you're talking about the story that that girl that brought in those potential artifacts, I think that could be a teaching opportunity as well for teaching somebody like that about big data, because if you find these things randomly out in the forest or in a stream bed or something like that, and you pick them up, and I should say seemingly randomly, but you find these things and you bring them in and you're like, hey, look at this weird thing I found. My brain said it looks like something because I recognize this pattern. Is it something, right? Well, there's two things that we can learn from that. A, it might be something, but we know more about it. If it's not obvious, then we need to look at the context, right? Because sometimes it's a projectile point and it's obvious and something like that. But if it's not, and it just could be something else, we need to look at the context. We need to look, where was that found? Was it in association with other cutting implements that we do know and can identify positively and say, yes, this was a bison kill site on the Great Plains. We know that. And pretty much everything here was used to process this bison, right? And we know that. Like, this tool doesn't look like something we've ever seen before, but look what it's in association with and look what we can do with it. More than likely, this is a thing that was used for this. So we can use that as an excuse to talk about in context big data like that. But then also, if you know the context, you could record all sorts of information about the environment that you may know nothing about and how to process it, and use your big data analytics later on and combine that with other data sets to say, well, yeah, this turns out this is something, and we can add that to what we know now about a list of tools or something like that.
Yeah, I'm going to throw out two other terms here. We were talking off air before we started recording about one of my favorite podcasts, which is the Monster Talk podcast. And one of the terms that comes up, two of the terms that come up very frequently are apophenia and pareidolia. That's when you have a lot of doilies.
Wow. No, that's just when you have two of them. Pareidolia. Yeah. I think it's dolia, pareidolia.
But that's the human tendency to see shapes that we recognize and to see patterns, right? Because that's the way our brains are structured. So I think it's very interesting that we can then, if you understand and accept that that's going to be our default sort of how we see and interpret the world, layering this other level, this big data level of analysis and critique, especially as critique, on top of that, might be able to break down these false associations that we make and maybe make some other new, hopefully more accurate ones. I mean, I don't at all recommend replacing that on the ground, local, discrete story kind of approach to archaeology with some, God's eye views in the sky, because I think that's equally fraught. But I think that you can use one against the other in the same way that we use multiple sensors for, any kind of sensor array kind of, subsurface view, one against the other to try to get a truer sense of what's actually happening below ground. We can use that to get an actual truer sense of what's happening societally with people across time. And I think that's a great thing. And I think that was also in this article, this Ars Technica articles, I think that this was a level that was in there implied throughout it, which made me happy to read.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, we are running a little long on this, so I'll just leave you guys to check out the show notes. We have linked to this article and the Journal of Field Archaeology. And let me take this opportunity to make one small correction from the beginning of segment 2, because I looked it up. Jennifer Willett, it's crazy. She's actually not a scientist. I just thought she was because of what she writes about. And I've read a lot of her stuff in the past, but she's a science writer. And there's a comment here. She actually has a BA in English and no scientific background whatsoever, but she got her job writing for the American Institute of Physics. And there's a quote in here on her Wikipedia page. It says that she was an English major with no science background whatsoever. While working as a freelance journalist in New York City, she was hired by the American Physical Society after they found out that it was easier to teach physics to people who knew how to write than to teach writing to people who knew physics. So it was easier to teach physics to a writer than a physicist on how to write.
No, that's awesome. That I think there's a lesson in there. I'm not sure. Yeah. Maybe we should explore this in some other episode, but there's definitely something to be learned there. And she's very good. And again, I do recommend this article.
Yeah.
And I do recommend that our listeners go then to the JFA special edition and download whatever articles there look interesting to them, because I think there's a lot of meat here. And that's that.
Yeah.
Also, please wash your hands.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wear your mask, social distance. I'm so fed up with this. Let's get out of this, please. Thanks for listening to the Archaeotech podcast. Links to items mentioned on the show are in the show notes at www.arcpodnet.com/archaeotech. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com and paul@lugal.com. Support the show by becoming a member at arcpodnet.com/members. The music is a song called Off-Road and is license free from Apple. Thanks for listening.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.